All right, good afternoon. I am recording. This is Jeff Scott. It's AWD1115, Database Driven Web Development 2. Today is day 57 of the class, Monday, the 3rd of April. And as it says on the email that I sent out this morning, we will spend this entire week going over chapter 13 of our textbook, the Bookstore website. I will tell you that it sounds as though talking to Mr. Gudmested, I don't know if he started on chapter 12 on Friday or he's starting on it today. He kind of gave me mixed signals, but we're basically ahead. So it gives the opportunity to take this chapter real nice and slow. All right. So what I'd like to do today is to go over as much as I can of what the author has in there. We're going to modify this Bookstore website to make it our own. But before we do that, let's just take a look at what is currently in there and we'll work from there. Again, your chapters 12 and 13 homework will be due 2 weeks from yesterday or a week from next Sunday, however you want to look at it. Plus, please remember that we only have class Monday through Thursday this week. We are off Friday. All right, so with that said, let's get started. I'm not sure the best way to do this. All right, hello, John. I just went through the email that I passed out or I sent out this morning. And what we're going to do today is to go through the author's version of this bookstore's the bookstore site. And starting tomorrow, we'll talk about how we want to change it to turn it into our own site. Chapter 13. So if you go in with the applications that are in the book, that's what I'm going to bring up in just a couple minutes. All right. And we are going to go over quite a bit of it. That said, my guess is 2.5 hours, I don't know, is about what we'll spend on this today. So as you can see, section off on the first two, the user interface and folder structure, and then the general purpose code. After that, we'll break it up into the other 4 areas, those being the author, the book, the cart, and then the admin area. So we'll look at all this stuff. And really, there's another thing in there too, and that's the genre. So we'll be looking at all of this. Okay. So as we take a look in here, in fact, I'm just going to move up a couple pages just to show you this. That in a nutshell, and I'll back up in a minute, but this is our project. You'll notice that it has 5 controllers. There is no controller for the genre if you look in here. All right, even though we're going to have a genre entity class. So we've got an author controller, a book controller, a cart controller, and a home controller. All right. You can also see, and I'm not going to read all these off to you, the rest of the stuff that's shown here is all under models. All right. So you can see we've got at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 subfolders, and some of those folders have subfolders. So it's going to really give us a chance to look at how this thing has been set up. All right, we'll spend a bit of time going over all of that. Also, this particular example, as you can see here, the views, again, since we have 4 controllers, an author controller, a book controller, a cart controller, and a home controller, we have the same thing in here for our views. Plus, we have an entire admin area. I'm not going to read any of that, but you can see it. And if you notice, there's even a validation controller in there. All right. And that will allow us to add and delete or modify books, add or delete or modify authors. All right. So we'll worry about that a little bit later. Let me back up again. So again, that's the way that it's going to be set up. All right. Now, I based the database that I created off of what's in the book here. However, and I think I told you this already, I added on to it. So in other words, our book entity has more fields in it than the one that they have in our textbook here. All right, just so we're able to make it a little bit more extensive. All right. Also, when you notice in here, they have theirs set up, and we can change this if we'd like, but theirs is set up to display no more than 4 books at a time. In other words, it's going to use pagination, and that's the first time we looked at it. It was interesting this past weekend at Rankin, we had an open house at Rankin Wentzville, and I was in there Saturday morning, and we had I don't know how many people came through, somewhere around, if I had to guess, maybe 50, something like that. And I showed many of them the project that we had been working on, the sales order for the mythical bicycle database. And when we had all 40 products showing at once, there was no pagination. All right, you know that already. And that was pretty ugly. It would have been nicer if, even for example, we had had 10 products on a page and had buttons to jump to page 2 or page 3 or page 4, etc. We didn't have that because we hadn't talked yet about how to do that. All right. The other thing we had not really discussed how to do is how to do sorting in here by different fields. And the way that we're going to do that, as it says on the bottom of this page, is the headers for our columns, all right, will be basically hyperlinks that when you click on them, it will automatically sort on that particular field. So we could sort by author first name, author last name, price of the book, etc. And I'm not sure, I think they did it this way, but I know in the past what they've done is if you click on that link once, it sorts it in ascending order. And if you click on it again, it sorts the same thing, but in descending order. So we're going to take a look at that kind of stuff, in addition to some other stuff. So this is the way the home page will look. I think I mentioned this the other day. We're going to change this. I don't like tuxedo books, so I don't care what you call it, but I'm going to expect you to come up with your own name. I'm going to expect you to come up with your own logo. All right. And I'd rather have you, even if you steal one from the internet, all right, that would be fine with me. As a logo or something like that. I don't like this tuxedo books. I don't even get it, to be honest with you. All right. This staff pick, I think I mentioned this the other day, but I'm saying it again. And that is, what it does is it literally will have 108 books here. So it's going to generate a random number between 1 and 108. Whatever that book that gets generated for that time is the one that's going to be here for the staff pick. All right. If you come up here and you click on books right here, it's going to bring up this page. All right, again, with 4 books per page, but we can change that if we want to. We may want to change that just because of the fact that with 108 books, there are now going to be 27 of these buttons, which is going to be pretty butt ugly. But as an example, if we cut it, let's say we even put in, I don't know, 10 books per page. That might be too big, but it might not be. But if we put 10 books in per page, then it would go to over here, it would go to 12. Or even if we put in 9 books per page, it would be 12, and 10 would be like 11. That wouldn't be too bad. But as you can see, when you look here, all right, these are all linked right now. And I guess that's what they're linking on. So you click on it once and notice it's in alphabetic order by title. All right. But I think if we link on here, it would be an order by author. All right. And we don't have it set up for genre and price. Maybe we'll even add that. I don't know. And you'll notice that for the first time, we also have a different kind of button that says add to cart. So we're literally creating a thing in here with a shopping cart in it. All right, let's keep going. As they say in here, the author's page uses EF Core. They all do. All right. The first and last names, again, as it says, are links just in the same way that, all right, so these are links here. And when we move this up, these are links as well. All right. Also, and this is the first time we've really worked with this in any depth and breadth of coverage. Hopefully you notice that what we have here is a one-to-many relationship that's showing. In other words, Agatha Christie is one author who in this case has two different books in their example. All right. So that is a true one-to-many relationship. In the past, we probably would have had her in here twice. So it would have been Agatha Christie and then this title, Agatha Christie and then another title. All right. Plus, we're going to be able to come in here. Notice the manage books. All right. So this will allow us, as it says, to either add a book or to edit an existing book or to perform rather a delete operation. So very similarly to what we talked about doing and what we did much earlier in the semester in that movies database, here we're going to try to set it up where we're really going to implement an admin section, and you'll have to be able to log in as an administrator to actually perform the CRUD operations that are the non-read CRUD. So create, update, and delete. Okay, and we'll have this is one for the books. We'll have a similar one for authors as well. All right, I already mentioned this to you. And one of the things they say they're trying to get in here, again, I may have mentioned this the other day, is they're trying to get a fat model, fat models, and a skinny controller. The idea is that the controller should only be communicating directly between the model and the views. So it should either be grabbing the initial uh, request in and sending it to the correct model, or it should be grabbing the information that was sent back to it by the model and formatting it so it can go out through the view. Ideally, that's all it should do. And when you think about it, our controllers have been doing a lot more than that. This is one of the reasons that the author basically has been kind of transforming in the book. And as you saw in the last chapter, all right, several different folders in the models folder. And again, we'll have the same thing here. All right. In fact, they even talk about them here. As it says up on top, the data layer folder contains the database context class, the query options class, the iQueryable extension methods, and two more subfolders, which contain the repository classes and the repository interfaces. All right. The domain model, as it says, it contains the entity classes. All right. As it says here, the books, the authors, and the carts. All right. As they mentioned, there's some, but not all of these are used by EF Core to create the bookstore database. There will be no, I don't think we have anything for cart in the bookstore database, but because that's going to be a person's cart. All right. The DTO, remember, is data transfer object. So that folder, as it says there, contains the classes used to be allowed to transfer data. All right. And notice they even mention here a DTO is a more general purpose object that can be used to transfer data to other locations. For example, as they mention in here, DTOs can be used in this example to store data in session state or in cookies. I'm still in the process of getting this whole thing together myself. My hope is by the end of this week or by the beginning of next week, I'll be able to tell you exactly how the rest of the semester is going to play out. If we get this whole thing done this week, that is, go over this entire database or this entire chapter and be able to make our modifications to it so it basically holds our stuff in it, then next week, ideally, we can go through chapters 14 and 15. All right. And if we do that, all that's left is 16 and 17. We're not doing 18 again because it's on Visual Studio Code. Now, Evan has found something where he thinks we are going to be able to stand this thing up using Microsoft Azure, and it will not require any cost whatsoever or a credit card. All right, he's been starting to do some work on that. All right. Then there's the extension methods, as is mentioned right there, and as it says, it contains class files to add extension methods to the string class. So it allows us to do more generic type of operations. All right. A custom list of cart item objects and to the session and cookie objects. The grid folder is going to allow us, as it says there, to create tables or grids of data. All right. There are some built-in tools that you get with C# to be able to use, with databases, data grid view, and there's a few other things. Some of those we talked about in the AWD1115 C# programming class. The view models folder, as it says, will contain the classes that hold the data needed by the views. All right. And as it says, there's going to be also a nav class in there that the layouts are going to use to be able to mark where you are, where a current page is active, etc. So as they mentioned, it's more of a utility class. So I already said this. This is how it'll be set up. We're going to take a look at it in just a moment. All right. I don't want to sit and read to you. So my hope is that you can take a look at what is shown in there, and it'll at least make some sense to you as we get started. All right, so let's jump into this, some general purpose code. So as the author mentions, in the next few pages, they're going to review some of this general purpose code. General purpose basically means that it's stuff that can be used by several entity classes, one or more entity classes, one or more controllers, one or more views, etc. All right. So the first example that they mention in there is the slug. We've dealt with the slug before. So if we take a look at it, all right, basically it's going to be able to come in here, excuse me, it's going to be able to come in here and do some replacement type of things in here. In particular, with the slug, it's going to be, I think it's going to be replacing our blank characters with a hyphen. We've talked about that before, and the fact that when you have a URL, you never want to have blanks in it. All right. If you do have blanks in it, they'll be replaced with their ASCII coefficient. It'll be like a %20 or something like that. But we're going to replace blank spaces. We're going to be replacing with hyphens, very similarly to what we did in the past. All right. The equals no case, kind of an important method, because as it says there, it allows us to perform case insensitive comparisons. All right. So notice it says, unfortunately, this method does not work with EF core queries. For those, you must use the standard equality operator and the toLower, but it will help somewhat. All right. The toInt, as they mentioned there, uses the try parse method to convert a string into an integer, and if it can't be converted, it's going to return a default value for an int, which is 0. So rather than blowing up, if we left something blank or had something non-numeric in there, it's just going to return 0. The capitalized method will use the substring method, as it says, to make the first character of a string uppercase and everything else lowercase. All right. Next, as it says, the second example presents an updated version of the query options class, that we looked at in the previous chapter. It says it adds an order by direction property to know, do we want to go in ascending order or descending order? You already know this, that ascending is the default, which, as it says there, if we don't set it to ASC, it'll automatically sort in descending order, Say that again. It automatically sorts in ascending order always, whether we put in ASC or put in nothing. So if we want to sort it in descending order, we have to specifically say DESC. All right. So there's the query options in there. And as you can see, there's the order by direction. All right. So as they mention here, the idea behind these classes, or these methods, I should say, is to make it easier. And also that you're doing things in a standardized way. Because if you're calling, if you're calling sensitive type of thing, for example, and you're calling it from one method and you're calling it from another method, but you're calling the same method, you're going to be doing it the same way, is what they're saying in here. All right. Chapter 12, as they mentioned, showed how to build a generic repository class. Notice, as they mentioned, to encapsulate code that interacts with the database. All right, what does that mean? That means that somebody else can use the class without being able to see the code and not having to know how the code works. They only have to know how to call it. So if they're calling something from in there, they need to know what parameters, etc., to be passed in. So as what's mentioned here, figure 13.4 presents a version that's similar to the one we looked at in chapter 12, but it adds more functionality. First, as it says, it returns a public read-only count property that's used to determine the number of paging links a view should provide. All right. Second, as it says, it adds an overload for the get method. All right. That calls the find method and passes an argument that it receives. Next, there'll be a build query method that accepts a query options object and uses it to build query expressions. You already know what query expressions are. You've written queries before. All right. Now, there's only so far in about 20 days that we can attempt to take this example that we're building. And what do I mean? Well, we've already gone through most of the major functionality. All right. And there will be queries that we will be running in order to see something in ascending or descending order, in order, etc. But when you start, getting even more specific than that, probably won't be enough time to go through that. All right. Okay. It says here the list method will call toList to execute a query and return a list of entities, and the get will call first or default, which will return either the first match or null if there are no matches. Fourth, as it says here, the query by the build query method has more options for sorting. We've already talked about that, ascending and descending. All right. In chapter 12, on the last paragraph here, they say the repository class implemented the iRepo or iRepository interface. It says that's going to be true of this one as well. All right. And they don't show it in the book, but it is in the code. All right. So there's a lot of code in here. Again, there's the count that we just talked about. Here we'll be able to call build query. All right. So as they mentioned, this build query will be used to help build query expressions. All right. By now, ideally at least, you have a very good understanding of the difference between toList and first or default. toList returns everything. First or default returns the first match, or if there are no matches, returns whatever the default is for the type of data you're requesting. So if it's a number, it returns 0. If it's a Boolean, it returns false. If it's a string, it returns the empty string. All right, so let's get into this then. So we're going to talk next about, as it says there, the paging and sorting of the author catalog. All right. Now, look at this first paragraph. says with web forms, a table that provides for paging and sorting is available out of the box. We're not using web forms. We're using core MVC. So as they mention here, you must roll your own. And that's where they came in and they were talking about this data grid. All right. So as they say here, the next few figures are going to show the code that the Bookstore website uses for the grid. All right. Again, the first two columns, all right, as it says, has headers with links so that you're able to sort. Part of the problem that you would run into, I don't see any reason why we couldn't sort on every column. So in other words, if the author, really, I think author only has a first name and a last name in it. I don't think it has. All right. So, it's possible it has more like a genre, the books the author's written, etc. But, do you want to allow the user to go and sort on any and everything that's in there? And before you would say yes, you'd have to know everything that's in there and any potential ramifications of doing that. All right. As I mentioned to you on subsequent links, then it's going to bounce back and forth between toggling between descending and ascending. All right. Okay. So they mention here, and let's look at that in a second. Figure 13.5 shows the author catalog after the user is sorted by last name in descending order and navigated to the third page of authors. So if we look on here, there it is. We're on page 3. Notice the last name is in descending order from H down to G, for example. All right. And as mentioned previously, there's only four per page, and we've only got 3 fields, and you can actually sort on any of the 3 fields. All right. All right. Now, notice that it says in the last paragraph here, for this to work, we need to add a custom route. We talked about routes in an earlier chapter, okay, to the program.cs file as shown below the URL. As it says, it specifies static segments, page, size, and sort that make the sort more user-friendly. So if you take a look in here and we look at what's in here, it's letting us know it's author, it's doing an entire list, so it's showing us everything. We're on page 3 of the list. All right. Let's see, the size per page is 4, and we're sorting by last name in descending order. And again, that's all the information, as it said there, that has been provided, all right, in the route. And that's it in here. So when they talk about the segments, that's really basically everything that we're adding in here. There's a segment, there's a segment, there's a segment, there's a segment. So what's in here then as segments are all the things that you see in here that are within curly braces, again, meaning that they're things that could conceivably be changed. You know this as well as I do, that if we went into right here, and for example, we either change that from last name to first name or from descending to ascending, or we left it blank, we'd get different results over here. All right, that shouldn't be any kind of a surprise. So again, you've already heard this. Now, the author's catalog displays 4 authors at a time, and it provides links styled as buttons that allow you to go through all the different pages of authors. In the grid, the first 2 columns are links, okay, as it says, that allow you to sort author by first name or last name. So this isn't going to be a sorting, it sounds like. This, if we click on it, is going to allow us to go to that book. All right. And finally, as it says, we have now gone in here and added the custom route for us being able to do our paging and our sorting. All right. All right. So remember, previously we were just told that since we don't get that real nice data grid view out of the box, we have to create our own. So what they're talking about in here is doing that and how you would do that. So as it says, it presents an abstract class named data grid view. We're trying to tie together a few things here. First thing, this is an abstract class. What does that mean? By now, you should all know that an app cannot be instantiated. So we can't make a grid data, but we can have something else like our book class or whatever class that we want to show in a grid format. It can inherit from grid data. And you're going to see that in just a bit. All right. You can see the stuff that's there in mustard yellow for the page number, for the page size, all right, the sort direction, and the sort field. All right. Then there's actually a little bit of math in here. What this is doing is it's figuring out the total number of pages. The reason that's important is, for example, with 108 books and 4 books per page, it's going to do the math and it's going to figure out when you do the divide that it's going to be 27. That'll become then something that we know that the page number, any page number between 1 and 27 will be valid, as an example. All right. You can see the sort direction in here that's telling it to sort in either ascending or descending order. And this is basically making it go backwards. So if the current one, all right, was equal to ascending, set it to descending or vice versa. All right. And they've got this make a copy so you're able to clone it. We'll get into that in just a bit. Now notice there's an example. There's the author data grid subclass. So as they mentioned here on the bottom of the page, this abstract grid data class is going to give us properties for paging and for sorting. And it'll also give us some general purpose methods. By setting all of that stuff up in here, all right, it's going to, again, we're going to be sure that it's going to be done the same way, regardless of what it is we're sorting and or paging. So then they say the author data grid class inherits the grid data class and sets the initial sort field in its constructor. That's right there. Doesn't have to be the first name. In fact, to me, it would make much more sense to have that be the author's last name than it does the first. All right. They also mention, when you look right here, it says that this property is decorated with a JSON ignore attribute, so it isn't included when the object is serialized to JSON. All right. Like I said, I'm trying to be as good as I can here and not miss anything. As it says with the clone method, because I jumped over it kind of quickly, it says it uses member-wise clone to return a copy of the current object. All right. It says, as you'll see later, this is called from the author list and the book list so that the view has 2 copies of the grid data class. All right. And I think that's going to depend on which thing that you choose as far as being, what do you want to see on the screen at that time? The toDictionary method, as mentioned, returns the values of the 4 properties as a string dictionary, which allows us to build links, as they mentioned, with the correct route segment values. So all of this stuff, for lack of better words, has to work together. All right. It also, and we just started looking at this, contains a subclass named author grid data. All right, as it says, it uses that subclass to work with values of the custom route. All right. In its constructor, it sets the default value of the sort field to the first name property. Then, as it says, the read-only is sort by first name property determines whether the authors are currently sorted by the first name. All right. Model and the author controller are shown next. Notice with the view model, it says this class uses 3 properties to store the data a view needs. All right, so if we look at that, okay, so what does it need? All right, the list of authors, the grid data, and the total is what they're talking about in here. All right. And the first paragraph is kind of what I just said, I guess. It says this figure also presents the author controller. It has a constructor that creates an author repository and assigns it to a private property named data. All right. It also has a default index action that redirects to the list action method. Notice as it says there, that list action method accepts an author grid data object. All right, so in other words, if we're telling it to list everything, it'll have to know where it is in the list as far as what to search and make sure we've got 4, if there are 4, all right, books per page. Again, I don't want to sit and read to you, and I'm doing enough of that anyway. So you can just take a look pretty much at the rest of what's in here. And again, I'm not saying it's going to make a boatload of sense right now. All right. But the idea is this, that if we can get this working, and then if we can make modifications to it so that, we have a new homepage and we have an updated books table, etc., and we can do all that and add maybe a few other things in here, you're making it your own. But again, the idea is still this. If you decide that you're going to put this, for example, at the end of the semester out on your portfolio, anything that's in your portfolio, if you get called in for an interview, they're going to expect you understand it. So I'd rather have you not even include it in your portfolio if we get done with this and you're like, I have no idea what this thing is, then you really shouldn't even have it in there. All right. In the author controller, then, these are all those things that we talked about before: page number, page size, sort direction. All right. And here they're saying set to first name, then sort by first name, otherwise sort by last name. So I guess the way they do it is fine. All right. Looking at the bottom of the page here on 519, as the author mentions, the list action method accepts an author grid data object, uses it to set the paging and the sorting values, and retrieving, since it's the author's page, the correct authors from the database. All right. It creates the view model with the author, the route, and paging data that is necessary, and the details that are in there, gets an author object and passes it to the details view. Again, we're going to get into this stuff, virtually all of it, a little bit more as we go on. All right. Then in our here, they say it's a strong whose model is an instance of the author list view model class. So if we take a look at what's in there, as you can see, we're setting the title here, and then we are setting the grid data, and we're mapping it to our current route. All right. And there is a bit of routing that's being done in here, as you can see. And again, down here, we're setting a sort direction. All right, either by first name or by last name. As we already mentioned, some of this is very similar to what we've done before. We've done this kind of thing where we put in a for each, put a table in there, and list it out all of everything. In this case, it's all of our authors. Some of it we have not done before. All right. They mentioned I'm down towards the bottom of the page here. It says below the table, a razor code block builds the paging links. Starts by reassigning a copy of the current route property of the view model. All right, then it defines that starts with an index of 1, and it goes all the way to the total number of pages you have in there. All right. All right, that's it for that one. Let's jump into talk a little bit about the book catalog. So remember, really the author is going to have the first name of the author, the last name of the author, and the name of the book. Right? I don't remember if we have anything else in our own copy or not. The book will be different. So what we will hopefully end up doing later this week will be a little different than what you're going to see in this section. So it says the book catalog page provides for paging and sorting, just like the author, but of course, since it has different columns in it, it uses different columns in it. All right. So they give an example here in figure 13.9. And again, you can read this yourselves in here. We're on page 2, 4 per page. We're sorting it by price in ascending order. All right. And you can see how it's going up. And that's totally up to you as far as, what you want to be allow them to be sorting on. Yeah, nothing else that's new in there. So just like with the authors, the book catalog page displays 4 books at a time, and it gives those things, they look like little buttons. All right. We have to watch out for that because they're only showing 8 buttons in there. You know as well as I do that when it gets to be 10, all right, or if we have 27 buttons in there, 4 per page, we want to make sure that all the buttons are the same size. They look uniform. And as an example, if we're going to have 9 per row or something like that, or whatever per row, that we line them up so that it looks as professional as possible. All right. In the grid, as it says, you can sort in ascending or descending order by title or by genre or by price. All right. So title or genre or price. Now, the reason I believe that they have it in here that you cannot search by author is when you look in here, they have used that method that we talked about last week. Because remember, we don't have a full name field technically. That field that you're seeing in there is a combination or a concatenation of first name, a space, and last name. So again, the book catalog page uses the same custom route as the author catalog page. And again, there's a lot of similarity in here, period. It makes sense for a lot of reasons. One being that you want your interface to look as standardized as possible. You don't want to confuse the user by having one set of their data look one way and another set look the other way. All right. Plus, it's unique enough that if somebody gets to here, they should have a pretty good idea. It also says books catalog up here, but even just looking in here, authors aren't going to have a title necessarily or a genre necessarily, or they won't have a price. Again, this is very similar to what we just saw As they say, it has many similarities to the author grid data class that they just showed. In the constructor, it sets the default value. All right, and it says then because it can be sorted by 3 columns instead of 2, it includes 2 Boolean read-only properties that determine how the books are sorted. All right. And that's there. Sort by genre, sort by price. Says again, these are decorated with a JSON ignore, so they're not included when the object is serialized over to JSON. All right. Okay. So next is the book list view model class. Again, similar to the one we just saw for authors, within that it has a collection of objects to display. All right. And as mentioned there, the book grid data object holds the values for the current URL and stores them. So again, in here, much of the code in here looks similar to much of the code looked at previously. Plus, since it's set up the same way, for example, when we want to come in and we want to find out how many pages we have, so we can figure out how many buttons to have, we can call one of those that extension method, the method that we showed earlier, and we're calling it from both of these. So again, it's code reuse as well. All right. The list action method, as mentioned right here, accepts a book grid data object and uses it to query and retrieve what you want. It creates a view model with a book, a route, and paging. This is virtually identical to what we just saw for the author. All right. Same with how the details action method gets a book object and passes it to the details view. All right. So speaking of views, the book list view, as they say there, and it's shown in the figure right here. Again, you'll notice we have a table in there that I believe goes into more than one page. It does. It's fairly lengthy. All right, so let's take a look at what makes that up. As they mention here, right near the top, the Razor code creates a book grid data variable named current and a grid data variable named routes that it's going to piece those together so you can, for lack of better words, know where you are at any time. Then they mention halfway down, like the author list view, this view contains an HTML table styled with Bootstrap to display the data. However, unlike the authors, this is coded within a form tag that posts to an add. It's because each book has an add to cart button. Yeah, you add books to the cart, but you don't add authors to the cart. So there's additional information that's in this example. All right. In the table, as it says, the column headers for the first, third, and fourth columns are links so that you'll be able to sort on those. And just like we saw before with the set, sort, and direction in there, same kind of thing. In the body, as they mentioned there, a razor for each is going to loop through and display for each book the title, the author or authors, the genre, and the price. All right, so we can even have multiple authors in here. Another one-to-many relationship where one book can have zero, not really zero, but one or more authors. And as they mentioned, this displays each author name and book title as a link to the details page. So ideally, what we're going to be able to do when we do this is if you click on a book title, it's going to show you for that book, all right, the details. In other words, it'll show you the title, it'll show you the author, it'll show you the genre, it'll show you the price, and it'll show you the summary. Those are some of those things that I added as we talked about earlier. All right, and that's pretty much shown right in here. All right, it's a little early, but let's take a break. Let's come back at 1:10 and we'll go over the cart page. This isn't taking as long as I thought it would. So we should finish this and be able to bring it up in our next part. So let's come back, please, at 1:10. Be right back. All right, it is 1:10, so let's continue on. So far, we've talked about the author page and we've talked about the book page and all of its different, the views and the controllers, etc. And so what's left are the cart page and then the admin area. So as it says, again, this will be the first time in here basically that we're going to be able to come in, just double checking, okay, that we're going to be able to come in and actually add things to a shopping cart. And notice that not only are we going to do that, but we're going to be using session state and we're going to be using a persistent cookie, meaning that we can put something in our cart, leave our session, come back the next day or whatever. And as it says, the bookstore website will remember what we had in between those sessions. Now, this is only a true application in a certain sense. And what I mean is one thing that we don't do in this particular example that you would do in a quote real life example unquote is we have no idea how many copies of each book we have, for example. Plus, when we take a copy of a book and we put it in a cart, we are technically not decrementing our the number of books that we have, or if we're taking one out, going back and incrementing. We're not doing. So they mention here, store website uses extension methods to try to make this easier to work with. This goes back, some of the stuff that's in here is more along the lines of the stuff that we talked about back in chapters 9, 8, 9, and 10, when we went in and we were talking about the NFL Teams app. All right. So as it says, the first example adds two extension methods, the set object to serialize and the get object to deserialize. We've talked about before what these mean. All right. Then it says the second example adds three extension methods, each to the request response cookie interfaces. All right. They make it easier to work with complex objects. As it says, it makes it easier to store integers and strings by adding methods similar to the ones for session state. All right. So if we take a look at some of those and you look at some of the stuff that's in here. All right. Let's just jump down to a little bit here. And you'll notice, well, for example, here we've got some stuff with a cookie and we tell it that it should last for 30 days. All right. Same thing down here. Okay. In both the set string and for the set int. So again, these are extension methods, and all that means is it's going to make it easier that when you're passing things around in a cookie for the system to not have to figure out the kind of data that it's holding. All right. And then we had some extension methods up here as well. And I know that at least some of these in here, we're doing the serialization and the deserialization. All right. Now it says next, it begins by showing the interface for the cart page. So this is it when you look at it. And notice, all right, we've got quantity in there, etc. All right, and you should be able to go in and edit the quantity, all right, and add additional books, and this should automatically update. All right. So when you look in here too, the other thing of note is that in our cart up here, okay, so in our cart area, that this comes in and there's a badge here that says we have 2 books in there right now. Okay. All right. So as it says to add a book to the cart, you click the add cart button. That should make sense. When the book is first added, it has a default quantity of 1. To change that quantity, you can edit the cart item by clicking the edit button. What does that mean? That means, again, it's not like a true app, because what we really should have done probably was try to implement this as the equivalent, not of a drop down list, but kind of like of a number list where you can, you can click on it and you can just have it add automatically for you. All right. The session state, as it says, is used to store books in the cart between requests. Well, that's typically when you're using a session and you're using it with a persistent cookie. That's the reason for doing so. All right. Says it also presents the cart item class. The bookstore website uses this class to store the selected book and quantity in session state. It also has the read-only subtotal property. So we're not even worrying, at least right now, about tax or anything like that. All we have is just a simple calculation that takes the number of books that you have, multiplies it by the price for that book, all right, and it gives you what you owe. All right, then it adds all of them together. As they say there, it's designed to be serialized to JSON in session state. It says you should be aware of 2 parts of this design. First, the subtotal is decorated with a JSON ignore. As it's a calculated value, you always want it to be as up to date as possible, so you don't store that in session state. Second, as it says, the book property is of type book DTO, or data transfer object type, rather than the book type. It says that's because the JSON serializer doesn't always work correctly with entity framework domain models. Like, all right, you can run into problems, was what they're saying. Another good reason it says to use the DTO class is that sometimes the domain model retrieves more data from the database than you want to store. So you can have more control over exactly what indeed is stored. All right. And as it says, you'll see the book DTO class in the next figure. So it's right here. And when you think about it, even though some of the stuff like this class, not a big class, that's not a big class. None of these here are big. But when you start putting all this stuff together, it's a little bit expansive. In other words, it is getting pretty big. But again, what the author is attempting to do as we're making our way towards the end of the book is to give you a project where they are combining everything we've done up until this point. And I believe I already told you this, but the reasons I want to go through chapter 14, which is on dependency injection, and chapter 15, which is more on tag helpers, is both of them add to this particular project that you're working on. Then in chapter 16, which is on authorization and authentication, now, I mean, once we set it up now in the database, anybody, you don't have to log in, you don't have to be an administrator. Anyone can go in and make administrative changes to books and authors. You, of course, wouldn't want that. So when we get to that into chapter 16, we'll set it up so only people who are registered as administrators can do that. All right. As it says, this class holds only the properties of the book class that are needed by the cart. So when we look in here, what are those? Okay, the title and the price, basically, more than anything else, which makes sense. All right, because when we looked over here, okay, we need the title, we need the price. Okay, now, do we really need the author? Not for transferring data, or we might, but we need the title, we need the price, we also need the quantity. So we're able to do the math and figure out what the subtotal is. All right. Now, they talk in here about auto mappers, and I tried to look up some of that stuff, and there is some stuff online, but as it says, it's well beyond the scope of this book, so I don't want to get into that at all. This is confusing, plenty confusing as it is. All right. It says many programmers prefer rather to store the minimum amount of data possible in a persistent cookie. Then when the user returns, the app uses the data in there to query a data store and restore the data in session state. Now, remember, again, as I mentioned, this is not a true application in that if I take a book and I put it into my cart and then I get out of that session and come back days or weeks or months or even years later, that book is still in there. But that doesn't mean that in a true application that that book would still be available in the database. All right. So they mention here that the minimum data needed to restore a cart item object is the ID of the book and the quantity value. Because really from the ID of the book, you can get the title, you can get the author, etc. Or you can get the price. So the only thing you don't have is the quantity. These classes, as it says, and extension methods make it easier to get book and cart information in and out of sessions and cookies. All right. There's a whole other thing in here that we could talk about that's not in the book. But for example, all right, the one problem that you could have when you use sessions, all right, is when you use sessions, what you're doing is typically when you create a session ID is created. It's a real huge number. And actually, trying to think what it looks like. Kind of looks like back when we were using object IDs in MongoDB, where it's a long string of characters and numbers. The problem that you can get with that is when you have a persistent cookie is, depending on how it's set up, typically that session ID object may remain open indefinitely. And when it does, you're always open to what's called session hijacking, where if somebody can get a hold of that ID, they can start ordering their own stuff, and the system has no way of knowing that's them. It's not you type of an idea. All right. And they explain that the whole card class in here. I think it'll make more sense, or hopefully it'll make more sense when we bring it up. Again, this is a bigger class than the other ones that we've had. And as we talked about before, all right, as far as what it needs in here, it's going to need what? We said it's going to need the ID and it's going to need the quantity. All right. Again, we can go and take a look at everything that's in here. All right, such as look at this get by ID. If there's nothing in there, or if there's no ID, you return null. Otherwise, you choose the first one that matches. Most of this by now, hopefully, is making sense because we've done get by IDs before, because we've done ads before, because we've done edits before. Notice with the add in here now, all right, we're saying if it's brand new, add it so it'll have a value of 1. Otherwise, if you basically click, then if it's already been in there, you want to increment it by 1. Nothing new there. All right. We've done edits before. There's nothing new in there. All right. So as they mentioned on the bottom of the page here, the cart class stores and retrieves the books a user places in their cart. As it uses persistent cookies and session state to do this, it remembers the user's cart between sessions. That's the persistent cookie idea. All right. Okay. The controller is shown next. As it says, it accepts, very similar to what we've done with other controllers, it accepts the bookstore context object. It uses the objects to initialize our repository that it stores in a private property named data. Okay. The get cart method gets a cart object and loads any and all cart items from session state or from a persistent cookie. So in other words, since it's persistent, we've left and we've come back, but we had the cookie persist, so it's able to go and load everything back into our cart again. All right. The index method runs when the user navigates to the cart page. The add handles post requests when the user clicks the add to cart button on the book catalog or in the book details. Otherwise, it says if the book is in the database, it creates a new cart object if there wasn't one in there. All right, with a default, just as we already mentioned. All right, so there they are. Remove, as mentioned here on page 544, handles post requests when the user clicks the delete button for a cart item. The clear is when the user basically wants to remove everything from their cart. The cart object then uses it to get a specific item. All right. If there is no item, no such item in the session, the code adds a notification page and reloads it. Otherwise, it passes the item into the edit view so you could change whatever. You could go and add another item or whatever. Finally, the checkout, as it says there, handles requests when the user clicks the checkout button. Notice it says, since the functionality hasn't been implemented, all this does is render a view. If you review the code in the download, you'll see that the view cautions against coding your own checkout functionality for security reasons. It also provides links to third-party services. We'll talk about that at another time. So both the remove and the clear. All right. With both of those, they're posts. You're either removing something that's there or getting rid of everything. Whereas with the edit, it has both a get and a post. The get to bring up basically your information, the post. So once you've created the information, it'll be able to save it. Right. So once you modified the information, it'll be able to save it. All right. Next is the index view for the cart. All right. And if we take a look at what's in here, you'll notice that we've got a form and it's got an unordered list in here. All right. And the list items, basically, they're going to be filled up with whatever you've got in there. All right. So here, as it says, there's your form. And I'm looking in here. Let's see. There it is. All right. So this is basically going to go through your cart and display everything that's in there. Last part that's discussed in here, as mentioned, is the admin area. All right. As it says, they're in their own area to allow an administrator to add, edit, or delete books, add, edit, or delete authors, add, edit, or delete genres. Says it's similar to what we've done earlier, except it has two features that are different. First, it has a specialized repository class for books. Second, it doesn't allow users to delete authors or genres that are related to books. So in other words, you can delete any book, but if you try to delete a genre and there are still books out there by that genre, you can't delete them. And the same thing with authors. All right. So as they say right here, it says most of the time, the generic repository class is all you need for basic CRUD operations. Sometimes, though, it makes sense to extend that class to add more functionality. All right. It says, for example, figure 1319 shows how you can extend this class to work with book objects. And that's what they're doing in here. So remember, we're talking about the ability to go in and perform basic non-read CRUD or CUD operations in here. All right. So as they mentioned, it starts by presenting a repository interface and adds a method named add update authors that accepts a book object, an array of author IDs, and a repository object for working with author data. Next, there's a book repository class, which is similar in nature. All right. Notice as it says there, the add update authors method encapsulates the code for setting the authors related to the book. It says it's a bit complex. Now, in the example that we have, every book has only a single author, but you should be able to go in and add an additional author if you were so inclined, and it should still work. All right. So they say the method here, the add update authors, is called when a book is added to the DB context object, as well when an existing book is edited. So they're going through the steps that will take place in here. All right. They do mention, notice, it's important down here to understand that the add update authors method does not make changes to the database. Rather, it marks author objects as deleted or added. Then when the save changes is called, then it's going to make the changes to the database. All right. But it does not need to access the database to retrieve author data, which is why, as it says, it accepts an iRepository author object. So again, the idea is they're trying to tie together in here most everything we've talked about for this entire semester. All right. So as mentioned there, the iBook repository interface inherits the iRepository book interface and adds a method for working with related author data. All right, kind of what we just went over. All right. The Bookstore app, as it says, warns users when they try to delete an author or genre that is related to one or more books that are in there. So they show an example in here. Can't delete author Agatha Christie. They have related books. All right, and the genre is going to look similar. Cannot delete on genre author. I'm sorry, genre history because books. So this related books page, that's what they're talking about here. All right. And I'm not going to read anymore because we basically have just said it. They even mentioned the only difference between them is the message that's displayed. So these are the same thing, only in this case, you can't delete an author, and in this case, you can't delete a genre. Remember, you never have that kind of thing about books. You can always go in and delete a book. All right. Where again, this isn't real reminiscent of real life, because if it was a real life application and you tried to remove a book and there were still copies of that book, you have to figure out how you'd be handling that then. All right. They mentioned here, and we're right near the end, the first code example presents the delete action method of the author controller. Receives an author ID, and it starts by querying the database to try to find an author by that name and all books related to that author. Then it checks whether the author object is not null and the book's property has a count that's greater than 0. All right. It says if these conditions are true, it means the author is in the database and is related to one or more books. All right. So basically, it doesn't want to allow that to happen. Or, it's going to redirect to a related view of the book controller. I don't know if it showed that or not. I didn't think it did. Okay. The second example, as it says, goes through a delete of the genre controller. All you're trying to do here is you're trying to make sure that your data is as up to date as possible. And you could look at it this way. You could really say that if I had a book in my database that didn't have a genre, if I allowed that to happen, or I had a book that didn't have an author, in many ways you could look at it as though my data has been corrupted. All right. So what we're trying to do is to make sure that indeed the data cannot be corrupted. All right. And that's it. Now, we went through that quickly, a lot faster than I thought we would. All right. But as they say, it uses professional coding techniques that are somewhat abstract and difficult to understand at first. It says if you don't understand right away, don't worry about it. It's okay to just get the general idea. So to help you understand it, it says you can start by running it to see how it works. As you do this, you can study the source code. So the plan is now what we're going to do is bring up, and you should have that already, the Chapter 13 books website program. We'll bring it up and we'll look at it and see if we can this stuff in action. All right. All right. So I've got it up here, Chapter 13 Bookstore. Again, you've already got that. So I'm going to bring it up here. Now, what should make sense to everybody is that when I take a look at this, all right, if I come in here and I go to View and I go to my SQL Server Object Explorer that's here, if I go over to this and I open this up and I open this up, I do not have a database called books. So it's not going to let me do very much. But if I do come in here and look, again, this is not my copy. This is the author's copy. If I come into Tools and I look under Tools, NuGet Package Manager, and I look under the Package Manager solution, what I do notice is SQL Server and Tools, and they've even got a debug in here. All right, and web code generation design. These are all have been added already. Now, the reason I'm telling you that is I'm going to close this and I'm going to come in and I'm going to open up the NuGet Package Manager and the PMC or the Package Manager console. All right. Then the next thing I want to do is I want to run here and add migration. And again, I'll call it initial setup. There might already be one, so I'm going to call initial setup JPS. So that's the one I did and hit enter. And there it is. All right. And now I'm going to try to do an update database. I wish that when I tried mine, it went this slick, but typically it doesn't. All right. Basically, there's the data being added. All right. So now I should be able to come in here. I'm going to minimize this as much as I can like that. And I should be able to refresh in here. bring it up, and I should now have a books database in here, or bookstore. There it is. All right, and under my tables, there's my authors table. In fact, I didn't want to bring it up like that. I wanted to show the data. We close this. See, and as far as our books go, it looks like we have 29 books. All right. And when we go down to our genres, we have about half a dozen genres. And when we go to our book authors, which is the last one here, all right, and that book was written by that author, that book by that author, etc. All right, so I'm going to close all of these. And I'm going to attempt to run it. And you can see when I do that, all right, it came up, for example, with, so we're going to look at all these in just a second, but it came up with beloved. So if I click on there, there it is. There's the details. And I can, if I want, add it to my cart right there. And then notice there already was stuff in there, it looks like. In fact, I don't think that's even, we now have one thing in our cart. So we can go over to our cart and check, and there's the one thing. If I change my mind, I can remove it, and you'll notice that that badge is now gone, and it says that it was removed from the cart. All right, go back to home, and you can notice that it's already picked out a different book. I can click on books right here. I get 4 books, and there's, like I said, there were 29 books, so we get 8 buttons. The last one should only have 1 book there, and it does. All right, I can click on the title and find out information about that particular book. All right, I can click on there and I can find out what books that author has written. So you can see it's kind of circular in a way, in the way that this is all going here. All right, I can click on author again, just like we did before, and they'll show you the books by that author. All right, there's also filtering in here. All right, so those are all my authors. Leave it at all. Those are all my genres. But if I only want mysteries, all right, I can click filter, and you can see how that changed. It's only 2 pages worth. All right. And again, I can jump back and forth. There's a lot of different stuff that I can do in here. And if you take a look, I'm going to grab this, a little hard to see. So I'm going to make it bigger. All right. So what's all in there? Well, just our port number, no biggie. Book, list, page. We're on page 1. The size is 4 per page. We're sorting it by title in ascending order, and we've applied a filter in there to show us all authors where the genre is mystery, and any book that's in there, because we've got price all. All right, so hopefully at least you start to see, when we go in here, some of the power of this. All right, and so again, I'm going to come in and I'm going to grab, I'll add this to the cart. So that was that Rebecca. I'm going to go into my cart. And now if I want, I can edit and I can change the quantity. Looks like they're setting it up to, can I put in more than 10? No, yeah. So let's put in 6 of these and save. Notice I now have 6 things in my cart, and my subtotal has been updated because my subtotal is my price times my quantity. All right. If I decide again, no, I don't want 6 of them, I only want 3. Boom, I change that, and as you can see, everything is auto updated. I can come in here with authors. Now remember, when you're working with authors like this, you're not buying anything. We're just looking at information. All right. I click on there. There are the works of Agatha Christie. So I can click on those. Right now, this is the details page. So again, their details page is only showing you the author, the price, and the genre. The one that I'm attempting to have us work with will also have a picture of the book. All right. I just think that's a little more descriptive. Plus, it'll have that book summary. I think that's a better representation of what you'd actually want this to look like. Again, notice I can add to cart here too. So I now have two things in there. All right, that Rebecca and then there were none. If I go and add these, I want 3 of those, so that's 32. One of these, 450. All right. So if I go to checkout, it should in here. I don't think there was a tax. So it should be a what? About 37 and a half bucks. All right. Well, now it says in here, don't roll your own checkout. It isn't secure. That's true. It says use a third-party payment service like Stripe. And what Stripe provides you, you can use Stripe, and there's a few other ones too. They provide a sandbox for you where you're able to go in and actually put in credit card numbers and everything, stuff you make up, but it'll create receipts for you and everything. Again, that's beyond what we're doing in this class. All right. One thing I mentioned to Evan is I said, Evan loves this book. I like this book. I don't love it, but he thinks it's one of the best books he's ever seen to teach a topic like this. And I just told him, I said, I wish that either in this book or in another book, and I said, I wouldn't even mind if there were 2 books for this class, but either in this book or in another book, what I'd like to see would be a running case study that starts in chapter 1 and goes through all 17 chapters and even provides a way in there where you can set up a checkout mechanism. All right, to me, that would be much better than what is shown here. It's not that what's here is bad. It's not. All right. Then when we look in here, there's a register, and notice registration has not been implemented yet. It is implemented in chapter 16. That's the authorization and authentication chapter. And admin, all right, so you can come in here. Okay, so I'm going to come in here and see. I think that was the way you spelled it. Rebecca. So I can edit what's in there. If I had the wrong author or whatever, I could change that. I could change the genre. I could update the price. Let's see if we change this price to $15.55. Just going to change that and click edit. All right. Well, we know that if we go into our cart, we already had that in there. Now that doesn't appear as though it was updated. All right. So that's something else we would have to take a look at. All right. So again, we can manage our books in there. We can manage our authors in there. And again, with books, we can add a new book if we want. You'll notice we got a drop-down list of authors, plus we can use control or command where we could select multiple authors, again, with that one-to-many relationship that we talked about. Now in here, we don't have that. Notice we do have this. You cannot select more than one genre. That's just the way this has been implemented. Something very similar in here then for authors. Again, where we can add an author. All right. As it says, we can select an author. I can, if I want to view all the books by Jane Austen. There they are. All right. And you'll notice that the one has got 2 authors. In the same way, I can play with genres. That's the simplest. And notice, like with view books. So here I've got history, and these are my books that are history. So I could, if I wanted to, go in and edit one of these, and I could change the genre. All right, so there's more than one way of doing the same kind of thing in here. All right, so That's quickly what we're attempting to do. All right. And again, I've already mentioned this, that one of the things I'm going to be wanting you to do is to go in here and change this. So start thinking, if you would, if you want to, you can make this, I'm not going to say as wild, but for instance, if you want, you can change the background color, the text color here, and or the background color here. I don't want you to call yours Tuxedo Books, and I don't want you to have that logo. All right. I mean, I want this to be, I would like to get a bunch of these turned in eventually that'll look a little bit different. All right. So what I am going to attempt to do by tomorrow is I'm doing it now, but it's not nearly finished, is to take this and correlate it with what I have in the database that I've created. All right. So what I'm hoping is, and hopefully what I'm saying right now is going to make sense. We're going to be able to go in and we will start a new project. We will add in our database, but I'm hoping we will be able to use a lot of the code that's in here where we might want to go in and steal different routines from this and put it in ours. All right. And that's what's going to, between that, having the book summary and the book picture and a different logo and title, etc. in here. That's what's going to differentiate what we're doing from the authors. Okay, that's what I'd like to get through with the rest of this week here. Now, maybe we can get into it tomorrow. Maybe we finish most of it tomorrow. I don't think so, but it's possible. All right, if we don't finish it tomorrow, of course, we go on to Wednesday, and if necessary, Thursday. We have no class Friday. But again, I'd love it if we got through this by the end of the week. As far as what is in here, all right, our case study, there is nothing for chapter 13. All right, so you can see that right now. And on here, wrote the wrong one up, sorry. All right, for 13, they want us to add pagination or paging, sorting, and filtering to the quarterly sales app. We don't even have that much data in ours, but that's still okay. And it's not really a whole heck of a lot they're asking us to do here. All right. So in an ideal world, if we would get done what I want to get done by Wednesday, we could do this thing in here on Thursday together. All right. We'll what works. And as far as the rest of the semester, chapter 14, the project, as it says, add dependency injection and unit testing. What we might do next week is to do this project, and I'm not even sure, I might very well might not even have you turn it in. I had said earlier that for 14 and 15, the only thing I planned on you turning in were the written tests, and I'd like to stick to that. But at the same time, I'd love it if we could look at this unit testing so you were at least exposed to it. Then in chapter 15, it's a brand new application, a blackjack app. All right, which if we have time, we can look at, and if we don't, we won't. Finally, chapter 16, as it says, it adds authorization. So the register login stuff that you see right here, you add that to the quarterly sales app. All right, so you're not able to do the CUD or the create, update, and delete operations on here unless you're logged in as an administrator. And as far as these, again, notice 14 has an automate testing, 15 has a use tag helpers, 16 has an authenticate and authorize. I would not require you to do those either. I mean, we're getting down here that come Thursday, got 20 days left in the class. And I have to be somewhat realistic over what I can expect you to do. All right. So that pretty much is what I had today. If you haven't had a chance to do so, please try to read the chapter. And tomorrow, like I said, we're going to see if we can kind of fold in to this. All right. We are going to create a new project and fold in as much of this code as possible and add our own code. All right. So unless you had any questions, John, That's all I had for today. I will talk to you tomorrow.